What does it take to be heard in a world that's trained to ignore your silence? I hope you and your family are well today, healthy in body, strong in spirit. As we age, we come to value not just the loud victories, but the quiet ones, the moments where courage isn't shouted, but shown in stillness. That kind of courage has a name in this story, Sergeant Dana Whitaker. Dana was 45, a proud Black woman and an honor guard at Arlington National Cemetery. She never sought the spotlight. Her boots were polished, her salute sharp, and her silence sacred. Every step she took down those hallowed paths carried generations of dignity. But even the most composed soldier must one day face a test outside the battlefield. When Dana was summoned to testify about a crime against a veterans memorial, she expected duty. What she found instead was something uglier, a courtroom steeped in arrogance and bias, a judge with a smirk too wide and a heart too cold, a moment where power mistook silence for weakness. But here's the twist. Dana didn't flinch. She didn't fight. She didn't even raise her voice. And somehow, with one simple act, she changed everything. Let's step into her world and walk through what happened next. The early morning fog hung low over Arlington National Cemetery, curling around the rows of white headstones like breath from the souls resting beneath them. The air smelled of dew and reverence. Even the birds seemed to sing quieter here, amid the hush boots crunched lightly on gravel in slow, rhythmic steps. Sergeant Dana Whitaker moved with solemn grace, her hands gloved her face, composed, her mind always clear. She had performed this ritual for 20 years. First as a soldier in active duty, later as a ceremonial honor guard for fallen veterans. The tomb of the unknown soldier wasn't just a duty post, it was a vow. Dana had buried friends, family, and fellow warriors. Each shift was more than a job, it was a covenant. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. Her presence spoke for her. Every morning at 5 a.m., she arrived in full dress blues pressed and perfect. She walked the same steps, polished the same brass, carried the same flag until it was folded with diamond precision. Tourists might have seen a figure of discipline, but to the families, especially the Black families, she was something more. A promise that their loved ones hadn't been forgotten. Donna lived alone in a small brick duplex in Fort Myer, walking distance from the gates. She had no children, never married. Her father had served in Vietnam and died of cancer in the early 2000s. Her mother, Etta, lived in North Carolina and called every Sunday without fail. "You still not dating nobody, Dana?" she'd ask, half joking. "You too quiet for your own good." Her best friend was a fellow honor guard, Marcus Hawk Hawkins, a tall, barrel-chested man from Chicago who called her wit and made it his life's mission to get her to laugh. He'd often say, "You got the heart of Harriet and the patience of Job." Most days, Dana worked in silence. She read old books about civil rights leaders and sometimes wrote letters to the families of the soldiers she helped bury, letters she never sent. Her TV sat dusty. She didn't do social media. She believed in quiet dignity, not hashtags. So, when the phone rang one rainy Thursday afternoon and a voice from the Department of Veterans Affairs asked her to appear in court as a witness, it was unexpected. They explained that a Black veterans memorial wall in a local park had been vandalized, spray paint slurs, even pieces chipped away. The city had caught the suspect, but there was controversy. The defense attorney claimed it was an accident, just kids being kids. Dana, however, had arrived at the scene during her off-duty time when she'd gone to lay flowers for a friend's name etched on that very wall. What she saw and who she saw could change the course of the trial. She didn't hesitate. "I'll come," she said simply. Marcus frowned when she told him. "Be careful, Whit. The court ain't no place for quiet folks. They hear volume, not value," but Dana just nodded. Truth don't need to be loud. That following Monday, she donned her full ceremonial uniform. Not the more relaxed version used for public events, but the complete regalia used at Arlington: white gloves, polished shoes, medals in place cap perfectly aligned. The courtroom in downtown D.C. was a gray, windowless chamber, high ceilings, and hard stairs. Judge Harold Voss presided, an older white man with jowls like a bulldog and a bench worn smooth from decades of authority. His reputation was well-known harsh with young Black men, lenient with misguided youth who just happened to be white. When Dana stepped into the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted, if only slightly. Her mere presence brought a chill of reverence, though not everyone welcomed it. She took her seat quietly at the witness stand, back straight, eyes steady. The prosecutor, a young Latina woman named Carla Jimenez, gave her a respectful nod. Dana returned it silently. But then Judge Voss cleared his throat. "Miss Soldier," he said, barely hiding a sneer, "you plan to testify looking like you're marching into a parade." The gallery rustled with discomfort. Dana didn't flinch. "This is my uniform, Your Honor. Same I wear to bury American heroes." A murmur passed through the room. The judge waved a hand. "Well, try not to distract the court with your presentation." He glanced at the defense attorney, who chuckled softly. It had begun. For the next hour, Dana was questioned not just about what she saw that day, but about her motives, her attire, even her credibility. Judge Voss interrupted repeatedly. "Speak up," he barked, though her voice was perfectly audible. "Are you capable of emotion, Sergeant?" he asked mockingly at one point. The audience squirmed. Donna never raised her voice, never cried, never stopped meeting his gaze. Then just as the prosecutor was about to finish, Voss suddenly slammed his gavel not on the bench but off it. It flew through the air. The gavel hit Donna squarely on the shoulder. Gasps, stunned silence. She didn't move, not at first. Then she calmly reached down, picked up the gavel, walked to the bench, and laid it gently before him. With clear, measured words, she said that Your Honor is assaulting a federal witness. The room fell completely still. In that single moment, with that single act, Dana Whitaker did what no shout, no protest, no hashtag had managed in that courtroom. She exposed the truth quietly, powerfully, and undeniably. The courtroom stood frozen. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed to dim under the weight of what had just occurred. A federal judge had thrown his gavel, not dropped, not accidentally released, but flung it in anger at a black female soldier in uniform. And she had responded not with fury, not with outrage, but with the most devastating weapon of all composed truth. Judge Voss sat slack, jawed, his eyes twitching between Dana and the gavel, now resting quietly on his bench as if it too were stunned by what had happened. The silence that followed was suffocating. People didn't even shift in their seats. The bailiff's hand hovered near his holster but didn't move. The stenographer's fingers hovered over the keys, frozen mid-sentence. Donna turned and returned to her seat at the witness stand, her gloves still white, her back still straight. She didn't look at the judge. Didn't look at anyone. The prosecutor, Carla Jimenez, blinked hard. She opened her mouth to object, to call for an immediate recess, to say something, but she didn't need to. Donna's words were still echoing. That Your Honor is assaulting a federal witness. For a long beat, Judge Voss said nothing. Then he barked bailiff clear the courtroom, but no one moved. The bailiff, an older black man who had seen too much and spoken too little for too long, simply shook his head. A whisper of resistance. "Bailiff," the judge repeated, his voice cracking this time. "I don't take orders from criminals, sir," the man said plainly. His voice was low but steady. "Not anymore." From that moment, the courtroom was no longer Voss's kingdom. Carla approached the bench, face tense. "Your Honor, we're entering official misconduct territory. I request a federal review and ask that court proceedings be suspended." But before the judge could respond, before he could even reassert what little control he had, left the rear courtroom doors swung open. In stepped Colonel Alana Brooks. She was immediately recognizable to those who followed military affairs. Tall, commanding, dark-skinned, and brilliant-eyed Colonel Brooks was one of the Pentagon's most senior legal counsels, and the first black woman to ever hold her rank in the JAG Corps. She didn't walk, she arrived. Wearing a tailored olive drab uniform with silver eagles gleaming on her shoulders, she scanned the courtroom with the precision of a battlefield commander. Every step she took crackled with authority. She held a thick file folder in one hand. No one stopped her. No one dared. Judge Voss's face drained of color. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm, clear and piercing. "My name is Colonel Alana Brooks. I am here on behalf of the Department of Defense and the United States Army. I respectfully request immediate administrative control of these proceedings, pursuant to Federal Review Section 38, CFR, picture 14-514, under authority of the Military Justice Oversight Act." "What the hell is this?" Voss sputtered, now visibly sweating. "This," she said, placing the file down on the clerk's desk with a loud thud, "is evidence of your repeated pattern of judicial bias, misconduct, and racially motivated rulings against veterans of color. We've been documenting your behavior for over a year. This case has confirmed what many suspected." She flipped open the folder, revealing hundreds of pages, transcripts, notes, testimonies, even email records. Behind her, 2 uniformed military police officers entered the room and stood guard. Voss tried to stand, but stumbled. "This is absurd. This is my courtroom." "Not anymore," Brooks said. "You just assaulted a decorated soldier, and your courtroom is now under review by the Office of Military and Civilian Judicial Affairs." The room buzzed with restrained electricity. Dana remained seated silent. The colonel turned to her. Sergeant Whitaker, you may stand down. We are fully aware of your record and your reputation. You've done more than enough. Dana slowly stood, saluted and nodded. No fanfare, no pride, just duty. It should have ended there, but it didn't. Word of what happened in that courtroom spread like fire. First on social media from a court clerk's whisper to a tweet. Then, a clip emerged. Someone in the gallery had captured the moment the gavel hit Dana and her quiet walk to return it. By evening, it was on every news network. A slow-motion video set to solemn music headlined "The Soldier Who Stood Still." Dana didn't watch it. She was already back at Arlington that night, walking her silent route under the stars. But across the country, the moment was no longer just a courtroom incident. It was a reckoning. Meanwhile, Judge Voss didn't go down easily. He railed against the accusations, blamed woke politics, and called Dana overdramatic. But his defenders were few. And the mountain of evidence Colonel Brooks brought with her, unshakable. Internal memos surfaced showing years of racially lopsided sentencing, private messages referring to black soldiers as fragile tokens, and deliberate delays in cases involving military personnel of color. Voss's resignation was demanded and received within 72 hours. But even as the system corrected itself, Dana remained unchanged. She refused interviews, declined appearances, ignored publishing offers. They want to put me on a poster, she told Marcus one morning, but the poster ain't the point. The wall is. Marcus grinned. You still too deep for cable news, Whit. Good. Veterans across the country, especially black veterans, began to speak up. Not to scream or riot, but to stand just like Dana had. In courtrooms, in city council meetings, at school boards, at home. One by one they stood. 3 days after the courtroom incident, Dana Whitaker was back on duty at Arlington. Fog blanketed the marble pathways, muffling the sound of her footsteps as she patrolled the tomb of the unknown soldier with the same deliberate pace as always. 21 steps south turned 21 steps north. She hadn't said a word to the media. Not one sentence to the dozens of camera crews camped just outside the cemetery gates. She ignored the endless stream of emails, letters, and voice messages pouring in from every corner of the country. Aren't you going to say something? Marcus had asked her. I already did, she replied. Dana didn't seek validation. She had done her duty. But the world wasn't finished listening. Across America, her image had become iconic. Not in a glossy commercial way, but something deeper. Churches showed the video during sermons. Schools discussed her case during civics lessons. Veterans groups started community roundtables to talk about racial equity in the military justice system. Social workers posted her, quote, truth don't need to be loud. It had touched a nerve, and not just among black veterans, but among Americans who had spent their lives shouting to be heard. In Dana, they saw someone who hadn't shouted, and yet still shattered a system built on silence. The Pentagon issued an official commendation for her unshakable poise and moral clarity under duress. Her commander tried to present it in a ceremony, but Dana declined. I didn't do it for decorations, she said. I did it for the names on that wall. Colonel Alana Brooks, however, wasn't finished. She had become the unlikely public face of the federal investigation into Judge Voss's history. At every press conference, she mentioned Dana not to glorify her, but to anchor the truth. This was not just about a single moment, Colonel Brooks said in one interview. This was about decades of disrespect against black service members. Sergeant Whitaker didn't expose anything we didn't already suspect. She just forced us to look at it. For all the applause, there were still challenges. Dana received hate mail, threats. Social media trolls called her UN American, accused her of orchestrating a publicity stunt. One anonymous letter accused her of ruining a good man's life for attention. She read them quietly, then fed them to the fire pit behind her duplex. One day, a local congressman showed up unannounced at the cemetery, surrounded by cameras trying to get a handshake for a photo op. Dana saw him coming from a distance and turned away, continuing her steps as if he didn't exist. That same afternoon, Marcus brought her a printed message from an 8th grade classroom in South Carolina. The students had watched her courtroom video and sent her drawings of soldiers' folded flags and one sketch of a black woman standing tall with a gavel at her feet. Dana held it for a long time. Kids saw you, Marcus said. Saw what it looks like to not back down. I didn't win anything, Hawk, she said softly. I just stood still. And that's exactly why it mattered. Meanwhile, Judge Voss's removal sent shockwaves through the judicial system. Other judges long considered untouchable were now under investigation. Attorneys who once shrugged off racial bias were being challenged by newly emboldened veterans, civilian and military alike. Colonel Brooks returned to Arlington one morning unannounced. Dana was polishing brass plaques outside the visitor center when she saw her. "I'm not here to make speeches," Brooks said. "I'm here because something's changing and I want you to be part of it." Dana raised an eyebrow. "Changing how?" "The Pentagon's opening an Office of Equity and Service Justice. I'm heading it up. We need someone who can teach others what integrity under pressure really looks like." "I'm not a teacher," Dana said flatly. "You don't have to be. You just have to keep doing what you're already doing, only this time people will listen." Dana looked out over the rows of headstones. "They only listened because of what he did, not because of me." Brooks smiled gently. "No, Sergeant. They listened because you didn't let it break you, and because you made us all look in the mirror." Dana didn't answer, she just nodded. That night, she sat at her kitchen table alone with her thoughts. She reread one of the student letters from South Carolina. A girl named Jasmine had written, "My daddy is a soldier, and he says you made him feel proud again. He don't talk much about the Army anymore, but he showed me your video and said, this is what a soldier looks like." That was the moment Dana allowed herself to cry, not out of grief or pain, but something else. Relief. Recognition. For so long, she had served in silence, carrying the weight of forgotten names and untold stories. Now maybe something would change. A week later, she agreed to one interview. Not for a network or a magazine, but for a small podcast run by a Black women's veterans group in Baltimore. Just a folding chair, a microphone, and a conversation. In that interview, she said something that would become etched into military history. The uniform don't make you invincible. It just reminds you that you're part of something bigger than yourself. And if you're lucky one day, you'll be tested not in combat, but in character. "I didn't pass that test because I'm strong. I passed it because I remembered who I serve." That clip too went viral. By now, even members of Congress were quoting her. Dana Whitaker, the woman who refused to speak for a courtroom full of power, had become the most respected voice in the country without raising her voice at all. But she still returned to Arlington every morning. Same uniform, same steps. Because history may change overnight, but tradition takes longer. And Dana Whitaker was nothing if not patient. The National Mall had never looked so still. Thousands had gathered on a brisk Saturday morning, standing shoulder to shoulder, not for protest, not for celebration, but for reckoning. A silent rally of veteran service members, families, and civilians had assembled in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. There were no chants, no marching bands, no angry speeches. Just stillness. At the center of the crowd stood a temporary monument, a bronze replica of a gavel resting on a folded American flag. It bore an inscription etched in brass, "Truth doesn't need to be loud." The rally had not been Dana Whitaker's idea. In fact, she had declined the invitation twice. It wasn't until Colonel Alana Brooks called her directly and said, "You don't have to speak. Just be there," that she agreed, begrudgingly. She arrived in uniform. People stepped back as she walked through the crowd, not out of fear or fame, but reverence. Families clutched photos of loved ones lost in Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam. Old men in wheelchair-bound VFW jackets saluted as she passed. A woman whispered, "That's her," and her child stood up straighter. But Dana felt the weight of it all like armor. Heavy and cold. On the stage stood a diverse group of speakers, veterans of every background, each one telling a story of injustice, perseverance, and survival. A Latina medic who was denied promotion despite a stellar record. A Black Marine who served 2 tours but was dishonorably discharged after being racially profiled on base. A Gold Star father who said, "My son died for a country that barely knew his name." And then Colonel Brooks stepped forward. Her voice, as always, was clear, crisp, surgical. When history looks back on this time, she said they won't remember a hashtag. They'll remember a woman who stood up without standing over anyone. A woman who faced a courtroom, a gavel, and a nation that doubted her, and she didn't blink. She paused, then turned. "I didn't ask her to speak. I didn't think she would. But she told me something once that I want you all to hear." Brooks stepped away from the mic. And to everyone's surprise, including her own, Dana walked forward. There was no applause, no music, just the hush of thousands inhaling at once. She looked over the crowd. Her face was still calm, but there was something different now, an unguarded weight in her eyes. She leaned into the microphone. "I was trained never to seek attention. Soldiers are taught to be invisible unless needed. That's what I was doing in that courtroom, my duty. I wasn't trying to prove a point. I wasn't trying to change the world." She paused. "But sometimes the world changes because you don't move." She exhaled steady. I was raised to believe that silence was strength. My mother taught me that. My father showed it. And for a long time, I thought that if I just worked harder, stood straighter, folded enough flags, buried enough of our own, maybe the country would remember us. A hush fell deeper. But some of y'all been forgotten. Some of y'all never even got seen. Black veterans, brown veterans, poor veterans, women in boots. Too big for the standard mold. You served just like everyone else, and then were expected to shrink when the war was over. Heads nodded, hands clutched hearts. I didn't ask for this stage. I don't want to be a symbol. But if standing still made people look up, then maybe it's time we stop ducking our heads and start demanding respect without shame. She looked out at the crowd, then raised her voice, not shouting, just firm. You don't need to scream to be heard, but you damn sure need to stand. With that, Dana stepped back from the mic. The silence lingered. Then slowly people began to rise, not from their feet, but in spirit. One by one, people stood taller, hands at their sides, chins up, not saluting, not chanting, just standing. Even in that moment, Dana didn't smile, but her eyes softened. The rally was broadcast live. News anchors were stunned. Social media exploded again, this time with clips of her voice clear, even, and ironclad. The phrase, "you don't need to scream to be heard," trended for weeks. But the real shift happened in offices and courtrooms across the country. State legislatures called emergency reviews of racial bias in sentencing involving veterans. The Department of Justice launched a task force on military civil rights oversight. A national database was created to track judges' rulings involving service members. Colonel Brooks, now officially appointed to lead the new Office of Equity and Service Justice, sent Dana an offer letter. Advisory role, quiet work, influence without bureaucracy. She even wrote at the bottom in pen, "It's yours, but only if you want it." Dana let it sit on her kitchen counter for a week. Then one morning she folded her uniform with care, placed it in her cedar trunk. She wasn't retiring, but she was stepping into something new. At Arlington, her boots made their final ceremonial walk, not because she was finished, but because her service was expanding. That afternoon, she met Colonel Brooks in D.C. to accept the position. Marcus drove her there, grinning the whole time. "So you gonna run the world from the back row now?" Dana smiled finally. "No. Just gonna remind it what quiet justice looks like." The office wasn't fancy, just a modest corner suite in a federal building nestled between rows of steel and concrete in southwest D.C. No glass walls or cherrywood desks, just beige carpet, recycled air, and a clear view of the Pentagon in the distance. Dana preferred it that way. She didn't need power to feel grounded. She needed purpose. Her new position, Senior Advisor for Veteran Justice and Equity, wasn't one you'd see on a news ticker. It didn't come with red carpets or fancy luncheons. But from this office, Dana began to reshape the very heart of a broken system. Each morning, she arrived before 7 a.m., files waiting, emails blinking, voices rising outside in the cubicles like a low hum of change. She brought the same precision to this work as she had to her ceremonial steps, methodical, measured, exact. Colonel Brooks had given her one piece of advice during onboarding: move like a ghost, speak like a bell. Dana did both. Her first mission audit all pending cases involving veterans of color in court systems across 5 states. She read every file herself, highlighting inconsistencies, flagging discriminatory language, and sending quiet memos to judges and clerks across the country. Within 3 months, she had uncovered over 200 cases where systemic bias influenced sentencing. She didn't go public. She didn't need to. The threat of exposure was powerful enough. Courts began self-correcting before the reports even left her desk. Her second mission was deeper personal. She initiated a national listening campaign not through panels or town halls, but through recorded conversations with veterans. She called it Standing Still Stories in Uniform. No cameras, no crowds, just one veteran, one voice, one story. They told her things they'd never said out loud. A black Air Force engineer who had spent his career getting passed over for promotions despite training white officers who now outranked him. A female Marine who had buried her trauma behind silence and was finally finding her way forward. A Cherokee Army scout whose unit had ignored his cultural rights and mocked his accent. Their stories poured out like truth released from captivity. Dana didn't respond with fanfare. She just nodded, recorded, cataloged, and built the largest oral history archive of underrepresented veterans ever collected by the federal government. Meanwhile, the impact of her courtroom moment continued to ripple outward. Schools added a case study called the Whitaker Principle to curriculum about constitutional rights. It centered around Dana's phrase, "You don't need to scream to be heard." Law students analyzed her restraint as a model of courtroom dignity. Veterans groups across the country started still standing chapters which promoted civil service advocacy without political labels. Not everyone embraced the change. Critics called it performative. Cable news talking heads labeled her a military pawn for woke politics. One senator even mocked her in a speech saying, "We don't need statues of silent women, we need action." He didn't realize that silence was the action. Dana ignored it all. She had a deeper measure of progress. One afternoon, a woman in her mid-30s knocked on her office door, a VA caseworker from Mississippi who had flown to D.C. on her own dime. "You don't know me," the woman said, "but I saw what you did in that courtroom. I used to think being quiet meant being invisible, but you taught me it can mean something else. I got a promotion last month because I finally stood up and spoke calm but clear." Dana handed her a small coin from her desk drawer, a smooth bronze medallion with the words "Stand still, stand strong." She'd had a few dozen made to give away quietly. The woman clutched it like gold. Even Arlington changed in subtle ways. The Tomb Guard program revised its training manual to include a section on vigilant presence, a nod to Dana's example. New cadets studied her ceremonial walk as a case study in emotional control. One even wrote a thesis on her posture, calling it an act of spiritual resistance. And then there was Marcus. He came by every Friday afternoon, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with a question, and sometimes with nothing but silence. "You doing all right, Whit?" he'd ask, even if it was obvious she was. Still standing, she'd reply. In quiet moments, she'd open the drawer of her desk and run her fingers over the folded flag she'd carried in her breast pocket during her testimony. It had belonged to her father, Corporal Isaac Whitaker, Vietnam, 1969-71. She never buried it. He made it home, she always said, but part of him stayed lost. She never talked much about what that gavel had done to her body, how the impact left a bruise the size of a silver dollar on her shoulder. What she remembered more was the sound of it hitting her, the way power made contact with silence. But she had taken that power and placed it back on the bench, on her terms. Months later, Chief Justice Lorraine Daniels invited Dana to a private dinner. "We're considering revising federal witness protocols," Daniels said. "Mandatory racial bias training for judges. Enhanced protections for uniformed personnel. I want to name the policy after you." Dana shook her head. "Don't name it after me," she said. "Name it after the ones who didn't get to speak." So they did. The new policy was titled the Silent Ranks Protocol. It passed the House with bipartisan support and was signed into law that same year. As the seasons turned, Dana remained the same, still calm, still composed, still deliberate. She didn't chase awards or titles, but she was changing lives from behind a plain desk with no nameplate, just a folded flag and a cup of black coffee. On the one-year anniversary of the courtroom incident, a modest ceremony was held not at the Capitol, not at a luxury venue, but on the steps of a veterans' memorial wall in the park where it all began. The newly restored section gleamed under sunlight, and the slurs gone, the names whole again. Dana stood at the edge alone. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a single white rose. She laid it gently at the base of the wall, bowed her head, and stood still, just as she always had. History doesn't always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it arrives on soft feet and leaves footprints that change the path for everyone who comes after. In the years that followed Dana Whitaker's quiet stand in that Washington courtroom, the world didn't flip upside down, but it shifted inch by inch. And every inch mattered. Across the country, local veteran affairs offices began implementing new accountability systems inspired by Dana's advisory model. The Department of Veterans Affairs, once bogged down by red tape and cultural blind spots, adopted a new training program called Presence and Purpose, a course built around understanding bias, practicing restraint, and serving with integrity. At the core of the curriculum were two case studies: the courtroom confrontation with Judge Voss and Dana's refusal to respond with anger. Recruits in both law enforcement and judiciary training programs were required to analyze her actions as a model of ethical resilience. Mock courtrooms now included Whitaker scenario drills, where instructors tested how well young judges could maintain composure in the face of difficult power dynamics. It was an ironic twist. Dana, the woman who had always stayed out of the spotlight, was now shaping the very system that once tried to diminish her. Meanwhile, the Silent Ranks Protocol, now federal law, brought about the first structured program of judicial accountability regarding veteran witnesses. The policy mandated the presence of an observer when a uniformed military witness was testifying, especially in cases involving racial dynamics. Judges found to violate behavioral conduct rules were no longer quietly reassigned or allowed to retire in peace. They faced disciplinary panels and, in some cases, disbarment. But legislation was only one part of the ripple. The cultural shift, the human part, was harder to track but more deeply felt. Veterans who had once accepted mistreatment or indifference began to demand more, not with fury or fire, but with firmness. They wrote letters, attended hearings, spoke at city council meetings. In Mississippi, a group of Black veterans launched the Stand Still Legal Aid Network, offering pro bono services to vets navigating complicated civil and criminal systems. In Oakland, California, a community college renamed their Veterans Center the Dana Whitaker Center for Dignity and Service. In Detroit, a group of retired Black servicewomen began hosting monthly Whitaker Circles, quiet gatherings where they wrote letters to families of the recently fallen, a tradition Dana herself had practiced in private. Even international veteran groups took note. In the United Kingdom, Canada, and Ghana, Black military associations studied Dana's story as an example of what it meant to serve both your nation and your people with grace. Her restraint became a global lesson in power dynamics. What it means when the oppressed refuse to let power define them. But for all her influence, Dana never stopped being herself. She kept a low profile at her DC office. She still walked to work, still kept her television off most days, still called her mother Etta every Sunday, who by now had become a bit of a celebrity in her own right. Baby Etta would say, "I can't go to the Piggly Wiggly without someone asking if I taught you that courtroom grace." "You did," Dana would reply with a small smile. "And you didn't even know it." And Marcus? He remained Dana's closest friend and steady reminder of joy. "You know they're gonna want a movie, right?" He teased her one afternoon over chess. "They can have the gavel," she said, "not the story." When he passed her bishop and smirked, she added, "Besides, I'm not done writing it yet." In the background of her accomplishments, the voices of those she inspired continued to grow louder. A young Black woman named Imani Jenkins, inspired by Dana's story, applied to law school and eventually clerked for a federal judge. "I'm not trying to be famous," she told her law review. "I'm trying to be still and effective." A high school senior in Birmingham, Alabama, wrote her college admissions essay on Dana, ending it with, "If I can move hearts without raising my voice, then I've inherited more than history. I've inherited power." And then there was Jasmine. Remember the 8th grade girl from South Carolina who had sent Dana a letter with a drawing of her, holding the gavel? 6 years later, Jasmine showed up in D.C. as part of a youth leadership delegation. Dana was told there'd be a small group tour but didn't know the details. When Jasmine walked into her office, Dana recognized her immediately. "You kept your hair natural," Dana said with a nod. "My mom said I looked like you," Jasmine replied. "I like that." They sat for over an hour. No reporters, no recordings. Just two Black women from different generations trading stories of hope, weariness, and duty. Before she left, Jasmine asked, "Do you still think standing still is enough?" Dana looked out the window at the distant flag over the Pentagon, then back at Jasmine. "Stillness isn't the absence of action. It's the choice to move only when it matters." The young woman nodded. "Then I'll move when it matters too." When Jasmine walked out the door, Dana let out a long, quiet breath. The baton had been passed not with ceremony, but with certainty. As years continued to pass, Dana's name became a staple in academic and legal spaces. But she remained uninterested in accolades. She declined the offer to have a bust of her sculpted for the Smithsonian. She turned down the Navy's offer to name a ship in her honor. Instead, she requested one thing, an engraved plaque at the Black Veterans Memorial Wall, the same one that had once been defaced. It read simply, "In honor of those who stood with dignity even when no one was watching. Sergeant Dana Whitaker, U.S. Army Honor Guard." People visited it, left flowers, wrote letters. Some stood for hours, others wept in silence. But none of them forgot the power of that moment when one woman picked up a weapon disguised as a gavel, turned it into an instrument of accountability, and gave it back not in surrender, but in strength. The echo of that moment still reverberates. And somewhere in the quiet of her modest home in D.C., Dana Whitaker still rises before dawn, still presses her uniform, still walks with the grace of a woman who knows her presence speaks louder than any verdict. Have you ever stood so still the world had no choice but to finally see you? We live in a time where noise often replaces meaning, where the loudest voices rise to the top whether they carry truth or not. In a world like that, it's easy to believe silence is weakness. That restraint is submission. That dignity is outdated. But Dana Whitaker reminded us of something many have forgotten. Stillness is not surrender. It's discipline, it's power, it's legacy. Dana didn't yell in that courtroom. She didn't throw punches or slam fists. She didn't even raise her voice when assaulted. She did something far more revolutionary. She stood tall, and that quiet defiance cracked a wall that had stood for generations. In her silence, she made others listen. In her dignity, she demanded respect. In her calm, she stirred a nation. So what does that mean for us, for you? Maybe you're not a soldier. Maybe you've never worn a uniform or walked 21 steps in front of a sacred tomb. But I'll bet you faced injustice. I'll bet you felt overlooked. I'll bet there's a moment in your life when you held your tongue not because you were afraid, but because your presence was your protest. You don't need to be in a courtroom to take a stand. You don't need to go viral to be valuable. You just need to remember who you are and hold the line. Whether you're working in a hospital, raising children, organizing in your neighborhood, or sitting alone at your kitchen table, wondering if your quiet efforts mean anything, hear me now. They do. The world changed not because Dana shouted, but because she refused to move on someone else's terms. So here's your call. Stand with grace when the world expects you to rage. Hold the truth even when it trembles in your hands. And know that your presence when rooted in purpose is power. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that silence can roar. Leave a comment if you've ever had to choose dignity over defense. Like this post if you believe stillness is strength. And most of all, subscribe to the Black Women channel where our stories rise, our truths shine, and our voices spoken or silent will never be erased. Because when one of us stands, all of us rise.